Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of the DD Geopolitics live stream. It's great to be back with you again today. Our second episode this week, and apologies, yesterday we were going to have a show, our weekly show with Rabar, but that's going to be on Tuesday, so make sure to tune in on Tuesday. But today we're joined by Rachel. Rachel, it's great to have you once again. You're always one of our favorite guests. And how are you doing today?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad that I get to join you for as long as we have left here in this world, as we are watching these reports that the Biden administration is saying, you know what, let's start World War III before, I guess, their time in office comes to an end. So, yeah, glad we still get to have these conversations while we still can.
Yeah, we might be on the verge of something crazy, and we'll get into the United States apparently giving the authorization to Ukraine to strike deep inside the Russian borders. So we'll get to that a little bit later. But Sarah, how are you doing this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are?
I'm coming out from under the weather, so I'm doing better. So good. I'm doing good. Thanks for asking. And you? Did we ask you? Does it matter?
No one asked me, but okay, it doesn't matter. I'll have a smile on my face either way.
Regardless.
How are you today, John?
I'll be smiling through the nuclear holocaust. Sarah said I'll be smiling through the nuclear holocaust about a week ago, and apparently we're closer to that than we expected. But we'll get into that. But I wanted to start off actually with a conversation about some of the cabinet picks before we just get too deep and dark into what could be the precipice of a hot World War III. Some people already say we're in World War III, of course. But before we get to that, I kind of want to get to maybe the lighter subject of discussion, which is Trump's cabinet picks. Rachel, I know that you've been following this to some extent over the last couple of weeks. We've heard Trump, since his victory, announced a number of cabinet picks. They kind of have an interesting quality to them because it's a good mix of your neocons, your standard Republicans, alongside some of your more chaotic picks, I guess I would describe them. So as just to name, some of the top picks that have been announced so far, as chief of staff, you have Susie Wiles. Secretary of State, of course, Marco Rubio. Attorney General, the nominee is Matt Gaetz. Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche. For the HHS Secretary, Bobby Kennedy. For the UN ambassador, we have Elise Stefanik. Of course, she kind of famously defended Trump in some of those hearings. We see a lot of quid pro quo here. For the border czar, it's Tom Homan. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and then Veteran Affairs, Doug Collins. And I'm just kind of scrolling down the list here to see if there's anybody notable. But those are some of the top picks. And I'm curious to kind of get your impression about how you think this cabinet is shaping up.
Yeah, it's interesting because in recent interviews that Trump did before the election, he said that the biggest mistake he made during his first term was surrounding himself with the wrong people. Now, I think a lot of us may have heard that and we thought, it's the John Boltons, right? It's the neocons who never met a war that they didn't like. And maybe in his second term, Trump is going to do things differently. And then we get to his cabinet picks for the second term and it's like, nope, it's a lot more of the same. It seems as though his saying that he was surrounded by the wrong people, what he meant by that was people who were not loyal to him. So that's a big theme that you see with this cabinet, is that you have all of these people who have made it known that they are Trump loyalists, that they are going to stand beside him. And you also have a lot of cashing in of that $100 million check from Miriam Adelson, in the sense that it seems like everyone is aggressively pro-Israel. Not just we're going to play the two-state solution game, right? We're going to act like we care about the Palestinians. No, they're not even wasting time on that. They're just going straight to talking about Israeli annexation in the West Bank, right? They want to see more Israeli settlements, and they are throwing their support behind Israel at a time when the rest of the world is kind of going, hey, maybe we should, back off of that a little bit, given the fact that we're finally getting to that point where we can talk about Israel committing a genocide openly in front of the whole world. But on top of that, it's also interesting to see his picks in the sense he did include Tulsi Gabbard as his director of national intelligence. There were a lot of people talking about her for Secretary of State. But then when you look at the person he did pick for Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, little Marco Rubio, the fact that he chose him, I was even a bit surprised, right? I expected the Elise Stefanik and some of these, well, I guess Mike Huckabee was another one, his ambassador to Israel. Some of these people that it's like, yeah, okay, he's going to have his picks. The Israeli lobby is going to have their picks. But to pick Marco Rubio for Secretary of State at a time when we're watching the Biden administration set us up for World War III, I'm very curious to see how long that one is going to last, because Marco Rubio is known for being a hothead. He's known for being a neocon who never met a war that he didn't like. And he's not exactly the diplomat that you want going and speaking to other officials around the world at such a delicate time when the Trump administration is coming in, claiming that they want to see peace around the world, claiming that they want to see an end to the war in Ukraine. And then you go and pick Marco Rubio. So it definitely feels like a game of kind of saying one thing and then doing another.
Yeah, I'm curious about what you make. I mean, Marco Rubio definitely is just one of the most well-known war hawks in Washington, D.C. It doesn't matter what region of the world you're looking at, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Russia, whether it's Latin America. Rubio's always taken these hawkish stances to inflict maximum damage, maximum suffering on the United States' perceived enemies. And it seems like it's really that group, that faction that's going to dominate Trump's foreign policy. One of the people I didn't mention on the subject of Israel is his ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, one of the most full-throated, rabid Zionists that you really could put in a position like that. But I'm curious about some of these other picks, because it seems like you mentioned the Rubio pick, the little Marco Rubio.
Talk about that
Trump,
one.
Trump famously, in his 2016 election, destroyed Marco Rubio in front of his own audience to massive cheers from the crowd, where he said Rubio's hated by all the people in Florida, Rubio is a warmonger, all of these things, and the crowd went nuts. And so you have this base in the MAGA movement that is clearly against some of these neocons. But the people who are the biggest, most ardent MAGA and Trump supporters seem to be focusing less on people like Marco Rubio or Elise Stefanik. And they're more doubling down on the attention that's paid to people like Matt Gaetz and Bobby Kennedy and Tulsi Gabbard. And then, of course, one of the others that we didn't mention was the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, right? This new concept being pushed by the Trump administration that's going to have Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy heading this department that's supposed to trim down government drastically. What do you think about these kinds of what I would describe as maybe faux anti-establishment picks? Will they have much of a sway within the Trump White House? And what's your expectation for potential divides and divisions within the Trump administration?
Oh, that's a good question. And yeah, I think I always go into this being as skeptical as possible, because definitely when we had the naming of these picks, right, when he announced that Marco Rubio was going to be Secretary of State after days of speculation, the New York Times had come out and said that this was his pick. He hadn't confirmed it. At the same time, he also announced Tulsi Gabbard as DNI. So I do think that there is a little bit of trying to say, hey, one for me, one for you, right? He's doing what he feels like he's supposed to do in terms of his backers, but then he's doing maybe what he wants to do or what he feels like he needs to do when it comes to his base, which is that the people want Tulsi Gabbard, the people want Bobby Kennedy. I mean, I have talked to several people who weren't necessarily even Trump fans, but when they talk about RFK Jr. and they talk about his Make America Healthy Again campaign and how he's promising to, do all of these things, get fluoride out of the water, right? Do his long list of things to make Americans healthier, they're on board with that. And they're going, I support Trump because he said that he would get Kennedy in there, and he is now fulfilling that promise. Now, granted, I'm always going to be skeptical about what Kennedy's actually going to be able to achieve, what he's going to do, especially after we saw his McDonald's photo op. But I do think it's interesting how Trump is kind of balancing right now the neocons with the more populist picks that the people want. Yeah, Matt Gaetz going in there as attorney general is going to be interesting to see, right? I'm very curious to see how that plays out. but it does make for a very kind of strange administration. We could definitely see some division. I mean, that's been one thing that the Republicans have kind of dealt with over the last few years, is those who are the more kind of MAGA loyalists, and then those who are the more moderates going, hey, let's just play along with everything and let's all get along around here. So I'm very curious to see how that goes, and also how they actually handle the topic of Ukraine, right? When you have this current situation where the Biden administration is ramping up, beating the war drums for more war with Ukraine, more of a direct war. And you have people like Trump, like his running mate, well, now his vice president, J.D. Vance, who have said they want to put an end to this war. They want to stop U.S. support for Kiev and its ongoing proxy war against Russia. And so you have all of this rhetoric on the campaign trail. And I'm really curious to see what they're actually able to accomplish when they get into the White House, especially as you've got the Biden administration really trying to make it as difficult as possible for there to be any peace come January.
Kind of wanted to go a little bit kind of one by one, because I think that there's like a couple, I think that each kind of one has a few facets to it. So somebody made a suggestion that I've also said, they said it in the comments. They said, think about it. He'll pull Marco Rubio into Secretary of State. That gives them the chance to move somebody else into Marco Rubio's spot. And then Trump can get rid of Rubio whenever he wants. And now he's banished from politics for good. So, I mean, that's something that could possibly happen. Also, I don't know who's running Trump's campaign, but whoever they were was very in tune with social media trends and who was sort of like what was kind of trending at the time. Obviously, Elon's involved in the administration, so that could be a big thing. Tulsi was picked because she's this based, cool surfer girl that like is kind of anti-war, but she's in love with Modi. Like nobody looks beneath the surface because she's the pretty face and she's fit and she shoots guns. Why is she the DNI? Guys, go Google it. She was in charge of psyops for the army. Like she was the head of the division of psyops. Like you really want that in charge of a national intelligence? Oh, but she's hot, has a nice butt. Oh, cool. And then we get to like I'll save Elon for last. RFK, which I'm kind of excited about his Make America Healthy Again. And I'm also excited for him to find out that he can't do anything about it because the mechanisms that are in place that have empowered these people are like ironclad unless we overthrow the whole government. But that's another story. He's another one. It was like, if you come in and endorse me, which was a huge shocker for all of those white liberal women, wine drinkers were like, Kennedy? Yeah. And then you have this Vivek and Elon, who I can't think of two more schemy, slimy feeling people that are running a department called Doge. Yeah. And everyone's tweeting out hashtags Doge. What is associated with Doge? Oh, I don't know. A huge crypto coin. Like this is like insane. This is I can't believe that people aren't honestly understanding what's happening, right? We're going through a process of international de-dollarization, and Trump is obsessed with crypto, and he's hiring all of these people. Even the guy, what is his name? Pete Hexeth? Wasn't he the guy with the tattoo? That the Crusaders tattoo? That is a huge topic of discussion right now on Twitter. Not the tattoo, the Crusades, the religious kind of versus the Judeo-Christian values. Once I saw that, I was like, who is running this camp? Like, who is picking these picks? Because they know what the hell is going on. Every day there's an argument over Christianity versus Islam. Every single day on Twitter in the biggest spaces. Whoever's like, what they know what's going on and they are picking accordingly. And it's a lot of this, like, here's the shiny thing. Don't look at what the right hand's doing.
Oh yeah, I'm with you on that one. And yeah, the Department of Government Efficiency, which I mean, to my knowledge, does not have any funding, I guess, yet. So I'm very curious to see what they're actually able to accomplish. Not to mention the fact that, I mean, Elon Musk, the billionaire who has profited so heavily off of government contracts, that seems like a very clear conflict of interest there. But it just kind of seems like Trump and his team are just playing this game right now. You know, like you were saying, with the way that they are paying attention to social media, the fact that, you know, Trump is going to watch UFC and he's got Tulsi Gabbard and Elon Musk and RFK and his little posse with him and all of these different people. And it's just
what are we doing? Well, the entirety of America is screaming because it's buffering and they're dying to watch this fake fight, which has crypto coins attached to the whole thing. And the whole cabinet is right there in the front row. And nobody is like, what is happening?
It's
Yeah.
absolutely insane. But you know, the thing that I love about the first Trump administration, and I think this one will even be more advanced, is just how out in the open everything is. They're shameless about it. Where the Democrats, you know, they perpetuate this corrupt system while pushing this veneer of civility that we're the adults in the room. This Trump administration has thrown that out the window. And like you said, Sarah, what a clear conflict of interest to have the owner of one of the largest companies in the United States running a program that is supposed to make the government more efficient. I mean, all of this is ripe for internal conflicts, for conflicts of interest, and it will play out in front of the American people. And what I'm interested to see, the question that I keep getting is like, how much can the pendulum continue to swing back and forth? Because in this last election, we saw the exit polls, and it was astonishing. It was like over 70% of people had little confidence or absolutely no confidence in their presidential picks, right? So even the people who were voting in the election, not counting the over half of the population, I'm not sure exactly what it was, but roughly half of the population, the voting age population that didn't even vote, even among the people that were voting, there's extremely low confidence in our government, historically low confidence in our Congress. And that's the question that I keep getting is, how will the pendulum swing back? Can the pendulum even swing back to the Democrats in 2028? I mean, their defeat was really historic. I mean, it was the first time the Democrats have lost the popular vote since 2004. And when you look at the map, it was decisive in terms of the entire geographic region of the country, excluding some of the small cities and coastal areas, some of the large cities and coastal areas, voted for the Democrats. But everyone else voted heavily for the Republicans, was clearly on board with the MAGA train over this kind of democratic liberalism. So I'm curious about what comes next when the people once again have their confidence in Trump eroded because of the conflicts and failures that are almost certain to come. What do you think comes next?
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously Trump has his second term now, so he won't, at least we know he won't be running again, right? At least we can rule it out. We can kind of start from scratch in 2028. I guess the question is going to be, are Democrats actually going to take this one seriously? Because I do not feel like they took 2024 seriously by throwing Kamala Harris in there at the last minute and by being like, look how great she is. She's raising all this money. Yeah, from a bunch of rich mega donors. Oh, and she's getting all these endorsements from celebrities that no one cares about, right? If ever we learned that celebrity endorsements mean nothing, it was this election, because that doesn't help us buy groceries at the grocery store. But when it came down to it, I am curious to see kind of how things will progress, because there's such a high right now off of, Trump is coming in and he's saying he's going to do all of these things and it's exciting. And look at this, we've got a new government department, right? And we've gotten for a lot of people that are kind of the more conservative, maybe more libertarian minded, they're like, look, you've got Tulsi Gabbard and RFK in the government. This is a big deal, all of that stuff. And the question is going to be, how long does that high last, right? How long do we give it until we get to the point of realizing, oh, it's likely to be the same old, unless there are any major changes, and they could surprise us all. That's always possible. But I've gotten a lot of criticism in recent weeks from people being like, oh, well, you're being too critical of Trump, right? He's not even in office yet, and you're already criticizing him. And I'm going, well, I did criticize him for his entire first term, as well as Biden, as well as everyone else who has been in this office. And part of that stems from the fact that they campaign on a certain thing, and then they get into office and they don't do it. And in a lot of ways, it's because they can't do it, but they still campaigned on it. I mean, Donald Trump told us that he was going to end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, that he was even going to do it as president-elect. Now, obviously, Biden is doing everything in his power to make sure that that's not possible. And I have a lot of doubts as to what Trump is going to be able to accomplish when he gets in office. If he goes to Putin with any kind of a deal like the ones that have been floated around in the mainstream media, Putin is likely to just laugh at him and be like, no, a frozen conflict? Like, no, there's no way I'm agreeing to that. So it'll be interesting to see how these 4 years kind of progress, and also where things stand on the world stage, because everything that the Biden administration was dealing with, the Trump administration is going to be dealing with. You know, when you're talking about tensions, unrest, and a genocide in the Middle East, when you're talking about the war in Ukraine and Russian forces advancing, and, you know, the US and its allies in Europe trying to figure out what they can do while also kind of realizing there's not much they can do. Oh, and then you also have Republicans wanting war with China as if everything else going on is not enough. So I'm really curious to see how we progress in the next 3 years, and if there are any third-party movements that really gain traction, because that's been the conversation for so many years. You know, why don't we see more support for third parties, candidates, for independent candidates, and that sort of thing? And Trump coming in 2016, he kind of came in as I am the answer, right? Acting like he was anti-establishment. And then he had a version of that in 2024. So without Trump there, it'll be very interesting to see where it leaves the country, because even if JD Vance is his ultimate successor and, you know, all of the focus is on Vance in 2028, he's still not Trump. And so a lot of questions waiting to be answered.
Well, you hear this from both the Democrats and the Republicans before their candidate gets in office. They're like, well, just give them a chance. You don't know what they're going to do. And they act as if we can't predict very accurately what their policies are going to be based on, okay, where's the money coming from? Who supports them? Who are they surrounding themselves with? And we're getting a clear picture of that with the Trump administration and the cabinet picks right now. And then, of course, in the case of Trump, we have a whole body of work to judge from 2016 to 2020. So this notion that we can't have some type of idea how Trump presidency is going to play out and some of its defects is just crazy. And we heard the same thing the Democrats were saying with Biden. Oh, well, just give him a chance. He might be able to change things. We stayed with the same fundamental course. And while I'm, pleased to see some of these people who are anti-establishment and kind of more chaotic picks expose some of the rifts in the system and create their own internal contradictions within the Trump administration, this notion that U.S. foreign policy is just going to do a complete 180 when the interests are so entrenched, it's just ridiculous. And then on the other side of it, it's like, but where does the American voter go? Because as you said, the Democratic Party is clearly totally captured by corporate interests. I mean, they outspent the Republicans 3-1 in this election in terms of campaign spending. 90+% of celebrities were with the Democratic Party. So clearly they have put their eggs in this basket. And this time, when Trump, if the wars continue, things continue to escalate, the economic conditions for the American people continue to deteriorate, where do the American people go? It's very unclear. And I feel like this is the era of potentially massive change. But Sarah, what do you think about that?
I don't understand why you keep on using the phrasing anti-establishment. What establishment are these people against? They're just looking for other ways, like different, less conventional ways to make money. Like what? I like to examine them by their interests alone. Just let's look at their interest in Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio never met a Latin American coup he didn't like. He also hates Cuba, Iran, Russia, and China. Like, we're trying to move forward and remove the embargo on Cuba. Now we know, I'm just saying, if it gets confirmed, that will never happen. Mm-hmm. Like Matt Gaetz, who has been under investigation. I love Matt Gaetz. Sorry, he's a guilty pleasure of mine. But Matt Gaetz, who has been under investigation, is now appointed to Attorney General. Like, these are not normal picks. Tulsi Gabbard is a crypto queen. Like, she's into crypto and all this psyop crap. Elon Musk literally just changed his platform. Now that the election is over, you're seeing a massive exodus because they're deleting all of the bot farms and all the libs are going over to Blue Sky. And now the new TOS has been put out that we're going to be teaching his AI all of our images, all of our words, and all of our audio. Will now train Grok to do whatever he wants it to do. Like, they have literally given Elon keys to the city. They're like, go ahead, just do whatever you want. Like, I can't, you keep saying anti-establishment. Elon is the new establishment. Like, they keep on telling us, oh, X is the best news source. Look at what we're competing against on X. to get
Yeah.
information out there. The likes of Suleiman and people who post AI pictures of Benjamin Netanyahu in a hospital and say that he's hospitalized. And people believed it for 24 hours. Like, that's what we're up against. So when Elon tells me I'm the #1 news source on this app, and from my experience with a fairly large account on that app and not getting anywhere near the reach that we should be, even on a good day, tells me that you're controlling the narrative and you've been given the keys to the city. He tried to control he did hugely contribute to the election of Milei in Argentina. He tried to get Maduro, like all of that mess, and it didn't work, thankfully, because there were so many of you guys down there already. And then he's messing around with Bolivia already. He helped to get Trump elected. There's no doubt about that. And his platform is completely unregulated now.
Right. So I think there's kind of a difference emerging here. And I use the word anti-establishment. It probably wasn't the best choice of words, but here's kind of the difference that I see is you have this liberal continuity, this establishment that's always had this credibility, recognition by the system as this legitimate authority. So it's this legitimate establishment, which is beginning to wither away and erode. And then in its place, you have like incredibly powerful people, of course, but they almost represent this kind of dark, shadowy, corrupt establishment. And this is kind of the division here. It's like this legitimized establishment under the norms of neoliberalism and liberal democracy is beginning to, erode and give way to this, what I call like shadowy establishment of open corruption, organized crime, and so on. So that's kind of like that's almost the difference that I see being expressed in domestic politics. But I think it's also a global phenomenon.
Yeah, and I think I would just add in, whenever John was talking about the anti-establishment, I almost kind of took that as the people like us, right? The people that sit around and we realize that, okay, the US is going nowhere good fast. We also realize that we're not going to be saved by any sort of political party that is going to be accepted here in this country in the grand scheme of things at the national level. Like, even if there were, the Doge party that was created tomorrow and all of a sudden it was getting all these votes, I'm going, I don't know, I would be a little bit skeptical. So kind of the people that are left out when you do have this new establishment, like the one that you were noting, Sarah, there with Elon Musk, where he's created this whole empire now and he's figured out a way to let himself be completely unregulated because he's following around Trump like his fanboy. It's like, yeah, they're the new establishment. There's a lot of people who are going to jump on board and say, okay, I'm here with that team. But then you also have a lot of people like us who are going to sit here and go, does no one see the writing on the wall and where this is headed here? And then we're just left kind of sitting here for the next 4 years going, okay, so how do we actually bring about change? Because we know we're not going to vote our way out of it, but at the same time, we also know that any kind of movement, it feels this way. I don't know if it'll be this way forever, but a lot of times when you get a popular movement, it's so easily co-opted and then divided. And then it's like, we never make the progress that I guess we would have hoped to when we get into it, if any of that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree completely, Rachel. And it'll be very interesting. And we talked about the issue of Russia, that being one of the areas that is most interesting to me because of the people who have expressed very clearly different opinions that have already been appointed or have been selected to cabinet positions in the Trump administration. Obviously, you have people like Marco Rubio, who time and again has supported U.S. military assistance to Ukraine and NATO involvement in that conflict. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have people like R.F. Kennedy, who ran a whole campaign basically being critical about NATO and United States involvement in all of the money that we're sending to Ukraine. So it'll be interesting to see this play out. And the backdrop to all of this, as the Trump administration gets ready to take office in January, is the continued escalation of U.S. involvement in Ukraine. Of course, Russia continues to make some pretty significant, or it seems like their advances are speeding up in some key sectors of the front. Of course, Russia has consolidated control over most of the 4 separatist territories in eastern Ukraine. And now we're hearing more signs that there will be a continued escalation on the part of the United States. We received reporting this week that the U.S. administration authorized the use of missiles with up with a range of up to 300 kilometers for attacks on Russian territory. This was stated by the EU head of diplomacy. We've not heard much from the United States themselves. We've also heard some concern from some of the US's European allies, including Germany. Olaf Scholz just today stated that he was not ready to supply Taurus cruise missiles to Ukraine and grant permission to use other German-made weapons to strike targets deep inside the Russian Federation, saying that he's already explained very clearly why he does not consider the supply of Taurus cruise missiles, the variant deployed in Germany, to be the right decision. And basically his rationale was that Germany would have to take responsibility for any attacks with these cruise missiles on Russian territory. Of course, the same principle should apply to the United States. How concerned are you about this development with the reported authorization of the United States for Ukraine to use its missiles to strike deep within Russian territory?
Yeah, I'm very concerned. I mean, just the fact that, and I know that the White House has kind of acted as though they're not really going to say much on this, but over the last 2 months, we've watched as Russian President Putin has made it very clear with his warnings. He said, look, if you remove these restrictions, if you allow Kiev to use long-range missiles deep inside Russian territory, we are treating those attacks not as if they're just coming from Kiev, but as if they're coming from the US as well, or whatever other Western country is involved, because of how deep their involvement is at every stage of that attack. So Russia's made it very clear, hey, we're not going to act as though, we just think that it's Kiev attacking us. We know how deeply involved the West is, the US in particular. And for the US to take those warnings and then to think, hey, you know what? We should go forward with this and keep escalating it, because I know that right now, Joe Biden is not making his own decisions, right? He's not the one in charge, but he is the head of the US establishment. And they are the ones who are looking at the next 2 months and realizing, oh, we're looking at dealing with a new president who literally ran on the campaign promise that he was going to end this war, that he wanted to see an end to the killing in Ukraine. Now, as much as we can debate how much he's going to be able to accomplish, sure, but the US establishment does not want that. So it's as if they're looking at this going, how do we escalate to the point where it's going to be really difficult for someone like Trump to really accomplish much when he comes into office, even more difficult than it already would be? And it's very concerning to me about what the US may try to do in the next 2 months, because as patient as Putin is, right, as patient as Russia has been as a whole, they still have put out these warnings, and they know that the US president is just the figurehead at the end of the day. They know that, 4 years of Trump is not going to magically fix US-Russia relations, even if Trump was literally coming in saying, no, we're pulling out of everything, give Russia whatever they want, we're done supporting Kiev. He's not saying that, but even if he was, Russia knows enough to know and has lived enough life and tried to deal with the West enough, from the Minsk Accords to the Istanbul talks of 2022, that they know that the US says one thing and does another. And when it comes to what it actually does, it is always looking to further increase tensions against Russia. And it's really concerning to me when I look at the Trump administration, in particular, Trump's pick for National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, because Mike Waltz believes that the way that the US should deal with this war is that they should try to increase pressure on Putin in order to, quote unquote, get him to the negotiating table. So he believes we go in there, we remove these restrictions on long range strikes, we further try to actually implement these energy sanctions on Russia, and we basically try to, put Russia in a spot where they're forced to come to the negotiating table, and then they, I guess, give us what we want, or maybe actually have a back and forth with Zelensky. I don't know what his dream scenario of it is, but when you have any rhetoric like that going around, even if it is from someone who's just going to be the national security advisor, it's not the Secretary of Defense, not the Secretary of State, sure, but it is concerning to me that that rhetoric would exist in the Trump administration, because it proves that someone like Mike Waltz has learned nothing over the last 3 years. And I'm very concerned about about what it's going to look like, even if you have Trump coming in saying, hey, I want to talk to Putin, I want to get this resolved. If he's met with the kind of rhetoric that Putin was reported to have used with his call with Olaf Scholz, where he's saying, you know, my demands have been very clear, then I'm curious what's going to happen, how Trump is going to handle that. And of course, how his administration, all of the neocons around him are going to handle it when he's coming back going, Putin didn't give me what I wanted. And then if he's coming back to people who are saying, okay, let's increase tensions and put the pressure on Putin, then no one wins at the end of the day.
Well, it's so interesting because we hear all of this rhetoric in U.S. news media that it's Putin is the one who's escalating. It's Russia who keeps changing the rules and continues to escalate because they want to wage this war. They just don't want to stop the war, so they'll do anything to keep it going. But we've heard, because we've been paying attention, that Putin's priorities in Ukraine have remained steady throughout the very start of the special military operation. And it's actually U.S. policy and the policies of NATO that have shifted over time, right? At first, the United States was saying, of course, we're not going to supply F-16s. This would be a provocation and irresponsible. We're not going to do that. They did it. We're not going to send tanks, Abrams tanks. Of course, they sent Abrams tanks that were, many of which were destroyed in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And then now we're seeing these long-range missile systems, which previously United States leaders have said this would be a provocation, something irresponsible. We'd have to take responsibility for it. Let's not do it. And now they've just slow-walked us through each of these lines toward escalation. Meanwhile, the Russian position has been steady, saying that if there's and it's never changed, right? Putin has always said, if there's a true threat to the sovereignty of Russia, if there's a true threat to the national security interest of Russia, then we will do whatever it takes to defend our interests. And so I did want to play a clip from Vladimir Putin back in September when some of this news was first coming out about the potential use of U.S. long-range missile systems by the Ukrainian army against the Russian Federation. So let's take a listen to his statement in September.
В последние дни мы видим и слышим, как на очень высоком уровне Великобритании и США муссируется тема о том, что киевский режим сможет наносить удар в двух территориях России западными вооружениями большой дальности. И, судя по всему, это решение либо вот-вот будет принято, либо, судя по всему, вообще уже принято. И эта вещь, конечно, экстраординарная. Хотелось попросить прокомментировать то, что происходит.
Происходит попытка подмены понятий, потому что речь не идет о разрешении или запрете киевскому режиму наносить удары по российской территории. Он и так наносит с помощью беспилотных летательных аппаратов и другими средствами, но когда речь идет об использовании высокоточного оружия большой дальности западного производства, это совершенно другая история. Дело в том, что я уже об этом говорил, и любые эксперты это подтвердят, и у нас, и на Западе, наносить удары современными высокоточными системами большой дальности западного производства украинская армия не в состоянии. Она не может этого делать. Это возможно только с использованием разведданных со спутников, которыми Украина не располагает. Это данные только со спутников или Евросоюза, либо на Соединенных Штатах, в общем, с натовских спутников. Это первое. Второе, и очень важное, может быть, ключевое, заключается в том, что полетные задания в эти ракетные системы могут, по сути, вносить только военнослужащие стран НАТО. Украинские военнослужащие делать это не могут. И поэтому речь идет не о том, чтобы разрешать украинскому режиму наносить удары по России этим оружием или не разрешать. Речь идет о том, чтобы принять решение о том, что страны НАТО напрямую участвуют в военном конфликте или нет. Если это решение будет принято, это будет означать не что иное, как прямое участие стран НАТО, Соединенных Штатов, европейских стран в войне на Украине. Это их прямое участие. И это уже, конечно, существенным образом меняет саму суть, саму природу конфликта. Это будет означать, что страны НАТО, США, европейские страны воюют с Россией. А если это так, то, имея в виду изменение самой сути этого конфликта, мы будем принимать соответствующие решения, исходя из тех угроз, которые нам будут создаваться.
В последние дни мы видим.
So you hear very clearly from President Putin there that the use of Western long-range missile systems against Russia, striking into Russia, would be the direct participation of NATO and Western countries in this conflict, and that it will change the very nature of the conflict itself. I'm curious about the timing of this. As I mentioned, we've seen this kind of slow walk into more and more involvement from NATO, from the United States, from the UK, from Germany in this conflict. And I'm very interested in the timing because, of course, we've entered the lame duck period of the Biden administration. Do you think that this bears at all in this kind of irresponsible use, this kind of irresponsible escalation on the part of the United States, reportedly allowing the Ukrainians now to use long-range weapon systems against Russia?
Oh, I think it's all about the timing, right? We got through the election. We got through kind of pretending as though, and granted, when it came to Kamala Harris and her campaigning on Ukraine, she didn't really say, hey, we're going to end the war. She just said, we're going to provide more support for Ukraine. So she didn't really give a straight answer there. But now that the election's over, and now that, as you were saying, we're in kind of that lame duck season, yeah, it's like the Biden administration can do whatever it wants to, and then they just get to walk away and let everyone else deal with the consequences, everyone else kind of being the rest of the world. I did think it was interesting there that in that clip, right, you're watching the fact that Putin has an immense understanding of exactly what is going on here, right? Exactly what it means for these long-range strikes to be carried out, exactly who is involved at every step of the way. And I'm honestly curious, does Joe Biden or Donald Trump have any sort of understanding like that? I really am curious to know how much they, and especially goes for Trump too, right? How much he actually knows and understands versus how much is just kind of explained to him by the people around him who are already his yes men, and how honest they are going to be with him as he gets into office about just how dire this situation is, but also how serious the moves that the US is making right now, how serious they are when it comes to setting us up for future war with Russia. Because as Russia sees it, kind of as I was saying before, they're looking at this as a decision that is made by the overall US establishment. They're not just looking at, Biden made this move and now Trump's going to come in and maybe Trump is going to change some things. That's not usually how it works, right? I don't expect Trump to come in and on day one remove the sanctions against Russia, pull funding from Kiev or anything like that, because we don't get that here in this country, even if the American people say, hey, we want to see an end to the war in Ukraine. But yeah, I am concerned about the timing and what else the Biden administration could try to do, as they're already doing everything that they can to funnel as much possible funding to Kiev, in other words, to launder a bunch of money before January 20th.
One of the big myths that we've heard is that if the United States continues to help Ukraine and whittle Russia's military capabilities away or strike within Russia, that over time it will cause a level of disunity with Russia, and that even people have gone as far to say that Putin can be overthrown and that the Russian people will rise up against him. We were just in Russia. I think that one of the things that was really notable to me is, even if there's some differences about the particularities of how the special military operation is being fought, by and large, the people are totally united against the threat coming from Ukraine and the West. And if anything, they have been solidified over the course of the last 2 years in their willingness to confront this challenge. And so it's just such a delusion. And we've heard this myth promoted not only by the Democratic Party, but it's many of the neoconservatives in the Republican Party who have been the most aggressive war hawks when it comes to Russia, when it comes to supplying Ukraine. So it is not clear cut at all that a Trump administration will actually be able to resolve this conflict. And I think that what you said made a lot of sense, Rachel. It's like one of the most important things that we need in order to actually resolve this conflict in order to have a settlement is to understand the fundamentals of the conflict in the first place. And it is apparent to me that even many in the Trump administration don't have a clear grasp of why the war is being fought, what the interests of the Russian Federation are, and the willingness of the Russian people to see this through and dispose of a threat along their border.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the things that I've learned from living in Russia in the past and being able to be around the Russian people is that here in the US, when we talk about us versus them, it's us versus our government, right? We're sitting here talking about the fact that, yeah, we just had Trump win and now he's got all of his cabinet picks, but we're looking at all of the ways that are they actually going to help us? Are they actually going to do anything for the American people and to follow through on any of their campaign promises? But in Russia, when they're talking about us versus them, the them is the West, right? The them is the US and the other countries that are directly targeting Russia openly so. And so, exactly as you were saying, even if people on the ground don't exactly agree, I mean, there's plenty of people in Russia that think that Putin should be going a lot harder right now. They think that, oh, Russia needs to go in, take out Zelensky, right, do much more than just the current war of attrition we're seeing at the speed that we're seeing it. And so while you may have those disagreements there, you do have a population that knows that the best way forward is stability. And they know that the current Russian government provides stability. That's why you saw such overwhelming support for Vladimir Putin in the last election. And I feel like when it comes to the neocons in Washington, right, the ones who dream about a day like Victoria Nuland, who dream about a day when the Russian people rise up and they overthrow their government, they only see regime change in this kind of one plan that they all agree on, right? Which is that you go in there, you create alternative media, which is really just propaganda spread around that is criticizing the government. Then you get groups together on the ground, right? They know the color revolution game and they think that they can apply that to Russia, not realizing Russia's watching everything that the US has done to really the entire world, but especially the other countries in the region and the way that it has treated them. And the Russian people are knowing we do not want that. And so as long as the US continues on in this way of acting like they can just allow the same rules to apply to Russia that have applied to so many other countries that they have targeted, they're going to keep losing in the same way that they thought, oh, we'll just make Russia the most sanctioned nation in the world and their economy will fall apart and everyone else will isolate them. Clearly that hasn't worked, but the US has refused to change its game plan or to realize that there is no winning here. So maybe we should back off of this and focus on something that is good for our own country for once.
Well, I wanted to ask you also about Europe and some of the European countries' involvement in this and where they stand at this point. We've heard conflicting reports. There's been a level of hesitancy that's been reported for countries like the UK to supply long-range Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine to use against the Russian Federation. Of course, I shared that quote from Olaf Scholz about his hesitancy and their level of perceived responsibility should Ukraine use their missile systems to attack the Russian Federation. But of course, these European countries at the end of the day have been the puppets of the United States. And it is likely that countries like the UK, France, if it's the decision of the policymakers and military leaders in the United States and NATO, that they will also permit their long-range missile systems to be used for strikes inside of Russia. And we've already heard some preliminary reporting that this might already be the case. But Europe, much like the United States, is feeling the impacts of the war very acutely. Of course, we understand the impact that the flow, this disruption of the flow of Russian energy has had on Europe as a whole. In some aspects, the European countries are feeling the pain of this war even more acutely than the United States. Although, of course, in the United States, we're also seeing a vast amount of resources that could otherwise be used for the benefit of the United States people be dumped into Ukraine. I believe that the official number is something like 200 billion since the start of 2022. It's probably much more than that. And of course, if we're looking a decade back, then it's in the hundreds of billions, probably approaching close to $1 trillion that we've spent arming and funding the Ukrainian government. But my question is more about Europe. And what do you see? How do you see their response? Because they're the ones that are going to be feeling the brunt of this. I mean, they're the ones that are in much closer proximity to the Russian Federation. And I'm curious about, should this escalate and should these missile systems be used? What's in store for Europe this coming winter and then over the course of the next year?
Yeah, if I were a leader within the EU, I would be getting very concerned right now, right? Because you're looking around and exactly as you were saying, realizing that in a number of ways, the EU is the one that feels the consequences first and feels them the harshest, whether that's just reducing their reliance on, cheap abundance of Russian energy as they have work to do over the last 3 years, or whether that's this war breaking out, it continuing to expand. And then you have all these countries in the EU that are right there and they're dealing with the direct consequences in that way, especially if it escalates. And so I don't think it was a coincidence that you had German Chancellor Olaf Scholz have this recent phone call with Vladimir Putin, their first in nearly 2 years. And even though Scholz came off of that and he was, expressing frustration, basically saying that, oh, well, Putin hasn't quote unquote learned anything. He's still sticking to his demands. And I guess that wasn't how Scholz rather thought that this call was going to go. The fact that he's talking to Putin is telling me that you have a feeling of uneasiness in the EU, realizing that if nothing else, right? I know that Trump is going to come in, that he has all of these promises, but if nothing else, you are going to see a significant reduction, arguably, of U.S. military aid to Ukraine. Now, they'll probably still pass some. I mean, I don't expect them to cut it off altogether, but compared to the high that it was at back in 2022, when it felt like every time we turned around, the U.S. Congress was, passing tens of billions of dollars in funding for Ukraine. Compared to that, we are in a completely different world right now. And so the EU is looking at the situation going, okay, we're the ones who are now expected to pick up the slack. But when you look at all of these recent regional elections that have happened across Europe over the last year, you're seeing this rise of right-wing parties that, in large part, they're calling out a number of things, including immigration and open borders, but they're also calling out the fact that why are we being called to support this war in Ukraine? It's not our war against Russia, unless you're Annalena Baerbock in Germany and you believe that wholeheartedly. But for a lot of the people across Europe, they're going, this is not our war. This is not our fight. Why are we being pushed to the front to where we could be forced to send NATO troops into Ukraine, right? Because as you were noting earlier, when it comes to these escalations, it is not going to stop here. It did not stop with F-16 fighter jets or Abrams tanks. It's not going to stop with long-range missiles. It's just going to keep escalating more and more unless we get any kind of significant change. And that especially comes from the West in the way that they are handling this. So I do think that the dialogue between Olaf Scholz and Putin was a good thing in the sense that they were at least talking, and Scholz was being made aware that, look, Russia knows it is winning this war. It knows that it is in a position right now where they're not going to entertain any of these ridiculous deals or proposals that have been reported in the Western media in recent weeks, where they're claiming that the Trump administration is going to come in and offer Putin a quote unquote frozen conflict, which really just allows NATO to rearm and rebuild Kiev's military over the next 10 to 20 years, that Russia's just going to look at that and laugh at that. So it's important for the West to realize that now, before they get to the point of actually walking in and acting as though they are going to accomplish anything whatsoever. But I do think there's got to be some uneasiness there as they start to realize that no matter what Trump is or isn't able to accomplish, at the very least, he's saying that he wants this war to end, which is something that the leaders within the UK and the EU have not been allowed to say because of the fact that they have been under the thumb of the US and of the Biden administration, which wants this war to go on forever until we wait for Russia to finally be impacted by it in a negative way.
Well, there's still this delusion, I think, in the West that Russia somehow isn't serious, that we can continue to intimidate them and escalate, and they won't take proportional responses because they have been so constrained. But with this recent announcement, I think that we're really seeing at least the rhetoric among Russian officials take a very, very serious tone. We had Vladimir Zaborov, the first deputy chairman of the Federation Council's Committee on International Affairs, talk about how the approval of American missile strikes deep into Russian territory is an unprecedented step towards World War III. That's the language they used, and that Russia's response, it won't be delayed, it will be immediate. And he was quoted as saying, "This is a very significant step towards the start of World War III, and the Americans will carry it out through the hands of the departing old man who will no longer be held accountable in 2 months." So I think that they're also looking at this lame duck period of the Biden administration as being potentially very dangerous. But Sarah, I wanted to get your analysis here. Are we really at the precipice of World War III?
I don't think so. No, just something to say on their way out the door.
Do you think the United States will? I mean, there's always this kind of
tension. Walking
tension.
it back, it sort of seems just like another Biden kerfuffle, or what do they call them? Gaffes.
Right.
It's a gaff.
Well, and I think that that's the hope, right? The hope is that cooler heads will prevail, that we don't get to that point. And we do know, too, that a lot of times, of course, because every Western media outlet that came out, from the Associated Press to the New York Times yesterday, they all cited anonymous sources. So we now have the White House kind of responding and, the State Department giving their version of it, right? Sure. But for all of these media outlets, they're citing anonymous sources. And that, to me, says that the Biden administration is trying to kind of throw this out there to see what happens, right? To throw this out there to see, okay, how is the public going to respond? How is Russia going to respond? Which they should already know, because Russia has made it clear for months now, their rhetoric has not changed. But I definitely think it was one of those things to see how the public was going to respond. And then they kind of figure out, okay, how do we proceed from there? And so my hope at my most optimistic is that the Biden administration will just look at, pumping a few more $1 billion worth of military aid into Ukraine, whatever we have to give, whatever they can get away with, as their kind of final act and the last thing that they do to quote unquote help Kiev, really just helping the regime continue on for a little bit longer, not actually helping the Ukrainian people, and that we don't get all the way to setting up World War III, but we'll see. A lot kind of remains to be seen at this point.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for taking the hour with us. It was a great conversation at a critical time, and if World War III does break out, we'll remember this one.
I have lectures to give. We can't let the world end.
Sarah's got a whole lecture series, and you guys better attend it, because Sarah is very smart and has a lot to provide. So
it's going to be really great. So we are starting a lecture series on the foundational blocks of political science. So people stop screaming that everybody's a communist and the other people are Nazis. We can learn about what liberals actually are, stuff like that. So I'm looking forward to it. We'll see what happens. I'll probably lose after the third episode.
And guys, we have some upcoming travel coming up. So if you can, please consider contributing. Area, if you could maybe throw up the link on the screen, that would be great, where people can donate. We have some historic reporting that we'll be able to hopefully undertake, as long as we don't get killed by NATO bombs in the process. So please consider contributing to our travel fund here upcoming in December. All of your contributions mean so much. And there are so few people who are willing to do this brave and courageous reporting, to actually tell you the truth about what's going on, who are outside of the mainstream bubble, willing to provide an independent analysis and actually get to the ground. All three, everyone on this panel is also a tremendous independent reporter. And we had one comment earlier that Sarah and Rachel, you guys are two of one of our commenters' favorite ladies in independent journalism.
That was a great comment. I didn't star it. I forgot.
Oh, well, that's awesome. Well, thank you guys again for having me. It was great to chat with you.
Ladies and geopolitics on this side of the aisle. Anyway, do I know any other girls that are? I do, but they're not streamers.
That's true. There's very few. Not a lot of competition, but you know what? I will take being the favorite, right? Let's enjoy it while we can.
You're right. I shouldn't be nitpicky.
There you go.
All right, guys. Well, we'll see you tomorrow for an episode with Ribar. And then we have more shows coming up later this week. So be sure to tune in. And thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Give us money. I'm sick.
Dude.